The flashing lights came before the silence. At first, I thought it was just another luxury car pulling into the circular driveway, the kind my father's guests loved to show off at his parties. But then, the red and blue reflections started sweeping across the ballroom walls, crawling over crystal chandeliers and polished marble like warning signs no one wanted to read. Music was still playing. Laughter still filled the room. Glasses clinked. Someone behind me was telling a story about a new investment deal, his voice loud and confident. But I wasn't listening. I was standing near the tall glass doors at the far end of the ballroom, fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass I hadn't touched all night. My eyes were fixed on the reflection of those lights growing brighter with every passing second. 14 years. 14 years of being ignored. 14 years of being laughed at. 14 years of hearing my own parents dismiss my career like it was some childish hobby I would eventually grow out of. And now they were about to find out exactly who I had become. Outside, the first black vehicle came to a stop. Then another. Then another. One by one. Doors opened. Uniformed officers stepped out into the warm Arizona evening. Their movements sharp, deliberate, perfectly controlled. Not 5 of them. Not 10. Dozens. More than I had expected to see with my own eyes. Inside the ballroom, people began to notice. Conversations slowed. Heads turned toward the doors. My father, standing near the center of the room with a circle of investors around him, kept laughing at something one of his business partners had said. He hadn't noticed yet. He always liked being the center of attention. Tonight was no exception. The banners hanging along the walls displayed his name in bold gold lettering. 70 years of leadership. 70 years of legacy. He believed this night belonged to him. But as the officers began walking toward the entrance, boots striking pavement in steady rhythm, I felt something shift deep inside my chest. I had waited 14 years for this moment, but even I didn't expect what would happen next. Because this night wasn't just about respect. It was about truth. And truth has a way of arriving whether you're ready for it or not. 14 years earlier, that truth looked very different. Back then, I was still sitting at the far end of my parents' dining table, trying to make myself smaller than the laughter surrounding me. It was a Sunday evening, the kind my father insisted on hosting once a month. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, covered in expensive china and polished silverware. My mother had spent hours preparing the meal, though most of the credit would eventually go to my father for bringing everyone together. Business partners filled half the chairs. Cousins and uncles filled the rest. Everyone important had a place at that table. Except me. I sat near the end, half hidden between a decorative centerpiece and a stack of folded napkins, listening to conversations that never seemed meant for my ears. That night, my cousin Tyler was celebrating a promotion inside the family company. Everyone clapped when my father announced it. "That's what hard work looks like," he said proudly, resting a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Commitment to the family." Glasses lifted. Toasts followed. Tyler smiled like he had just been handed the keys to something sacred. Then someone turned toward me. It was my Aunt Linda, smiling politely. "So, Rachel," she asked, tilting her head, "what are you doing these days?" The room quieted just enough for my answer to matter. I opened my mouth. "I've been working with federal..." But my father cut me off before I finished. He laughed. Not softly. Not privately. Loud enough for the entire table to hear. "She just files paperwork in some government office." Laughter followed immediately. Not cruel laughter. Not the kind meant to hurt. Worse, dismissive laughter. The kind that shrinks you until you barely exist. I felt the heat rise in my face, creeping up my neck and settling behind my eyes. My fingers tightened around my fork, though I couldn't remember lifting it. Across the table, my younger cousin leaned toward his brother and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Paper girl." They both smirked. My father continued talking like nothing had happened, launching into another story about expanding property developments and new investors flying in from out of state. No one returned to my question. No one asked what I actually did. It was like my voice had been erased before it ever reached the surface. Later that evening, someone asked my father if I planned to join the family business. He didn't hesitate. He shook his head, smiling like the answer amused him. "No," he said confidently. "She wouldn't survive a week in real work." More laughter. I glanced toward my mother then. She didn't laugh. But she didn't speak either. Her eyes stayed fixed on her plate. Jaw tight, shoulders stiff. A silence that looked like guilt but felt like surrender. That night, after the guests had left and the house finally quieted, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes beside her. Water ran steadily from the faucet, filling the silence between us. "You know your father doesn't mean it that way," she said softly, not looking at me. I kept scrubbing the same plate long after it was clean. "Then what way does he mean it?" I asked. She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "He thinks you're wasting your potential," she finally said. I turned off the water. The sudden silence felt louder than any laughter I had heard earlier. Then she added something I wasn't supposed to hear. "He's already chosen who will inherit the company." My hand froze on the edge of the sink. Later that night, I walked past my father's office on my way to bed. The door was slightly open. Voices inside. I didn't mean to stop. I didn't mean to listen. But then I heard my name. "She's not part of this company," my father said firmly. "Never will be." There was a pause. Another voice, my uncle's, asked quietly, "What if she proves you wrong?" My father laughed. Sharp. "Certain. She won't." I stood there in the hallway, staring at the thin line of light spilling from beneath the door. Something inside me shifted that night. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something quieter. Something stronger. That was the night I stopped trying to belong and started building a life they would never understand. The next morning felt strangely quiet, like the world had decided to hold its breath before something irreversible happened. I woke before sunrise, even though I had barely slept. The words from the night before still echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a recording I couldn't shut off. "She's not part of this company. Never will be." I lay there staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, watching pale strips of sunlight creep through the blinds. The room still looked the same as it had years ago. Certificates framed neatly on the walls, ribbons pinned to a corkboard, reminders of every achievement that once made my parents proud. Back when success meant something to them. Back when I still believed approval was something you could earn if you worked hard enough. That morning, something inside me felt different. Not broken, not defeated. Clear. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't want their approval anymore. I wanted distance. I got dressed slowly and made my way downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, mixing with the faint scent of toast. My father sat at the large granite island, newspaper spread open in front of him, glasses resting low on his nose. He didn't look up when I entered. Not even for a second. My mother stood near the counter, stirring cream into her coffee with small, careful movements. Her shoulders looked tense, like she had carried the weight of the previous night into the morning. "Morning?" I said quietly. No response from my father. He turned a page of his newspaper like I wasn't standing there at all. A few seconds passed before my mother forced a small smile. "Morning. Rachel." My father cleared his throat and spoke without lifting his eyes. "We've got meetings stacked all day," he muttered. Investors flying in before noon. No mention of last night. No acknowledgement of what I had overheard. Nothing. Someone, one of my cousins who had stayed overnight, walked into the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes. "So what's your plan now, Rachel?" he asked casually, reaching for a glass. Before I could answer, my father spoke again. "She'll figure something small," he said with a shrug. "Something safe." The words landed heavier than they should have. Not loud, not angry, just dismissive. Like he had already decided how small my future would be. Later that morning, he called me into his office. The room smelled like leather and expensive cologne, the same way it always had. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, framed photos, and awards that celebrated decades of success. He stood behind his desk, hands resting on the polished surface. "I've been thinking," he said without looking at me. I stayed silent. "You should come into the business," he continued. "Start at the administrative level. Learn the basics." Administrative level. I knew exactly what that meant. Not strategy. Not leadership. Paperwork. Filing. Numbers no one important wanted to deal with. "You'll sit in accounting," he added. "Handle routine documentation. It's stable work. Safe. Safe." That word settled between us like a quiet insult. He wasn't offering me opportunity. He was offering containment. A place where I could exist without threatening anyone's position. "I already accepted another position," I said carefully. That got his attention. His head lifted slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to show surprise. "What kind of position?" "Federal Records Division." The silence lasted only a second before he laughed. Sharp. Short. Unimpressed. "You chose paperwork over opportunity?" he asked, shaking his head. There was something colder in his expression now. Not disappointment. Contempt. That afternoon, he made sure everyone knew about my decision. We gathered again in the living room. Relatives scattered across couches and armchairs. Conversations floated through the air, casual and careless. My father stood near the center of the room, retelling my choice like it was a joke he couldn't resist sharing. "She turned down the family business," he said loudly. "Decided she wants to push papers instead." Laughter rippled across the room. Not surprising. Not new. Just familiar. I watched faces carefully this time. My uncle shaking his head. My cousin smirking. One of my aunts whispering something behind her hand. And my mother, silent. Always silent. That night, she found me alone in the laundry room. The sound of the dryer hummed steadily, filling the air between us. "You know your father worries about you," she said softly. I folded a towel slowly, smoothing out the edges. "Or worries about control?" I asked. She hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. "He doesn't trust outsiders," she said quietly. "He believes family should stay inside the business." Something about the way she said it lingered longer than the words themselves. Not trust outsiders. Not trust anyone outside his reach. Weeks later, I stepped into the Federal Records Building for my first official day. The place looked nothing like my parents' world. Gray walls, long hallways, rows of desks filled with quiet professionals who spoke only when necessary. No bragging. No laughter at someone else's expense. No favoritism. For the first time, I felt invisible in a way that didn't hurt. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant free. Days turned into weeks. And I worked harder than I ever had before. Every document mattered. Every detail counted. Every pattern became a challenge to solve. One afternoon, my supervisor called my name unexpectedly. "Rachel, step into my office." His tone was neutral, but something about the way he closed the door behind me made my pulse quicken. He studied a file in front of him before finally looking up. "Your performance metrics are strong," he said. "Accuracy. Speed. Pattern recognition." I waited. He slid a document across the desk. "We're offering you placement into a restricted internal program." Restricted. Confidential. Different. "What kind of program?" I asked. He leaned back slightly. "One you won't be able to discuss with anyone," he replied. "Not coworkers. Not friends. Not family. Family." That word settled deep in my chest. "If you enter this program," he continued, "your work becomes private. Permanently." I stared down at the paper in front of me. Something about this felt bigger than filing records. Bigger than paperwork. Bigger than anything my father could imagine. Later that evening, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot, watching the sun sink behind the buildings. The confidential document rested in my hands. The ink on the page looked ordinary, but the opportunity behind it felt anything but. For years, my parents believed I had chosen a small life, a quiet one. an unimportant one. But sitting there in the fading light, I realized something that made my heart beat steady instead of nervous. That was the day I stopped being the girl they laughed at and became the woman they would never see coming. The first day I stepped onto the restricted floor, I knew my life had changed in ways I couldn't yet understand. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, even though the building itself hadn't changed. I stood alone inside the metal box, watching the numbers climb one by one. When the doors opened, the hallway waiting on the other side looked nothing like the rest of the office. Quieter, colder, more controlled. A security officer sat behind a desk I had never seen before. He didn't smile. He didn't greet me. He simply checked my badge twice before nodding toward the door at the end of the hall. Everything about that floor felt deliberate. No casual conversation. No laughter. No idle chatter echoing through cubicles. Just quiet movement and focused faces. When I reached my workstation, I noticed something that made me pause. A new nameplate sat neatly on the edge of the desk. Not my department. Not the division I had originally joined. Instead, bold black letters read, Financial Crimes Intelligence Unit. I stared at those words longer than I meant to. Financial crimes. Not paperwork. Not routine records. Something deeper. Something serious. Before I could sit down, my supervisor approached. Conference room? He said simply. Now, the room he led me into had no windows. Thick folders stacked along one wall. Large digital screens glowed softly with graphs and charts I didn't yet understand. 4 other people sat around the table. No introductions. No small talk. Just quiet nods. My supervisor stood at the front of the room, arms folded. This unit analyzes patterns of financial misconduct. He began. Money laundering. Shell corporations. Property fraud. The words landed heavier than I expected. This wasn't paperwork. This was investigation. He handed each of us a thick file. Everything you see in this room stays here, he said firmly, his eyes locking briefly with mine. Not a suggestion. A rule. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were pages of financial statements, property records, corporate registrations, and transfer logs. At first glance, the numbers blurred together into meaningless rows. But the longer I looked, the more something inside me shifted. Patterns started to form. Repetition. Movement. Connections. The same company names appearing over and over again, but attached to different addresses, different properties, different owners, or at least owners on paper. Hours passed without me noticing. I traced lines across pages, marking connections others hadn't highlighted yet. Then something caught my eye. A structure repeated across 3 separate companies. Same formatting, same transfer timing, different names, but identical behavior. It didn't feel random. It felt planned. Later that afternoon, I sat alone at my desk, cross-referencing the company names listed in my file. The more I studied them, the more uneasy I felt. Transactions moved in loops. Property bought, transferred, sold, bought again. Money flowing in circles without creating real value, movement without growth. That was when I saw a company name that made my stomach tighten. It looked familiar. Too familiar. But I couldn't place it immediately. I stared at the letters, repeating the name quietly under my breath. Something about it sat in the back of my memory, waiting to surface. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. The same long driveway, the same tall front doors, the same perfectly trimmed landscaping. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But this time, I walked inside with different eyes. Not as a daughter trying to belong, as someone watching, listening, studying. Dinner unfolded the way it always did. Loud conversations. Expensive wine poured freely. Business deals discussed like casual stories. My father sat at the center of the table, confident as ever. Expansion is moving faster than expected, he announced proudly. New partnerships. New properties. Everyone listened closely. Everyone admired. And then I heard it. A company name spoken casually during conversation. The same name I had stared at hours earlier inside my case file. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I forced myself to breathe normally. "What kind of company is that?" I asked casually. My father answered without hesitation. "Just a holding company," he said smoothly. "Nothing complicated." Too smooth. Too quick. Across the table, my brother Daniel avoided eye contact entirely. His shoulders stiffened slightly. My mother reached for her wine glass and took a long sip before speaking. "Did you see the news today?" she asked suddenly, redirecting the conversation. Too coordinated. Too immediate. Multiple reactions at once. Not coincidence. Cover. That night, back in my apartment, I reopened the case files. The glow from my laptop lit the dark room as I cross-referenced the company name again. I pulled public records, corporate registrations, property filings, one by one. The connections began to stack. Then I found it. A digital signature, scanned and attached to an authorization document. I zoomed in, studied the lines, the curves, the angle of each stroke. Something about it felt deeply familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Not random, not distant, personal. I leaned closer to the screen, heart beating harder than it should. The signature belonged to someone connected to my family's business operations. Not my father. Not yet, but close enough to matter. Trusted. Embedded. Someone who had attended our dinners, shaken hands with investors, smiled across our dining table. "No," I whispered under my breath. It couldn't be right. It couldn't be happening. The next morning, my supervisor called me into his office. He studied me carefully, like he was measuring something beneath the surface. "Have you recognized any names?" he asked calmly. My pulse quickened instantly. This was the moment. Truth or silence? Duty or loyalty? I forced myself to remain steady. "No confirmed connections yet," I replied carefully. He nodded once. Slowly. "If personal connections emerge," he said, voice firm, "you must report them immediately." The words echoed in my mind long after I left his office. Later that evening, I sat alone in my car in the parking lot, staring straight ahead at nothing. My hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. For the first time, my career and my family had collided. Not emotionally, not symbolically, literally. And as I sat there in the fading light, one terrifying thought began to take shape. That was the night I realized something I wasn't ready to accept. The people who laughed at my career might be the very reason it existed in the first place. The next morning, the weight of what I knew pressed against my chest before my feet even touched the floor. I stood in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. My mind kept circling the same thought like it was trapped inside a cage. The signature. That familiar curve of ink that refused to leave my memory. It wasn't just numbers anymore. It wasn't just anonymous transactions hidden behind corporate names. Now there were faces behind the data, faces I had grown up around, trusted, laughed with, and that changed everything. At work, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. When I walked onto the restricted floor, I noticed more agents than before. More conversations happening in low voices. More files stacked across desks. Something had shifted. Something was building. I sat down at my workstation, trying to steady my breathing as I logged into the system. Overnight, several new files had been flagged for urgent review. Bright red markers flashed beside their titles. Urgency. Expansion. Escalation. I clicked into the first file and began scanning the contents. Property records. Corporate ownership charts. Transaction logs stacked in tight chronological order. At first glance, it looked like chaos. But beneath the noise, patterns were forming. Later that morning, our team gathered inside the intelligence room. A massive digital board filled the wall, covered in lines connecting company names, properties, and transfer histories. It looked like a spiderweb, a complex system designed to confuse anyone looking from the outside. "Our investigation has widened," the team leader announced. pointing to newly added connections glowing on the screen. We've identified additional shell companies operating under layered ownership structures. I watched the web expand in real time. New companies added, new lines drawn, new money movements traced. Then something caught my eye. One of the highlighted property addresses looked familiar. Too familiar. I leaned forward slightly, reading the street name again. It sat only a few blocks from one of the major commercial properties owned by my father's company. A chill crept down my spine. That evening, I drove to my parents' house again. The driveway lights glowed softly as I pulled in. But something about the house felt different. Still beautiful. Still impressive. But quieter than usual. Less welcoming. Daniel answered the door when I knocked. For a brief second, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different. Because he behaved differently. "Hey," he said quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His handshake felt weak, slightly damp. Daniel had always been confident, borderline arrogant. But tonight, his movements felt sharp and distracted. His phone buzzed in his hand before we even reached the dining room. He glanced down at the screen immediately. Then again, and again. Too often. Dinner started like it always did, wine poured generously. Expensive dishes served in perfect sequence. My father launched into another conversation about expansion and financial growth, his voice filling the room with practiced authority. Then I heard something unexpected. "Did you hear about Lawrence?" One of my uncles asked casually. My father nodded once. "Retired," he said. "Decided it was time. Retired." The word sounded too simple. Too clean. Lawrence had been the senior accountant for the company for years. The man who handled major property documentation and financial reporting. Men like him didn't retire without warning. Not suddenly. Not quietly. What made him leave so fast? I asked carefully. Daniel shifted immediately in his seat. My father answered before anyone else could speak. "Personal reasons," he said sharply. Short. Closed. Final. The conversation moved on quickly. But something had changed in the room. I could feel tension moving through the air like static electricity. After dinner, everyone gathered in the living room. Conversations broke into smaller clusters, but I stayed quiet, watching, observing. My father poured himself another glass of whiskey, then another. My mother sat stiffly on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel stepped outside twice within 10 minutes, each time checking his phone before disappearing into the darkness. Something was unraveling beneath the surface. At one point, I passed near the hallway leading to my father's office. The door wasn't fully closed. Voices leaked through the small opening. Low. Urgent. I couldn't hear every word, but one sentence slipped through clearly. "Not until everything is finalized." My father's voice. Cold. Controlled. Back at work the next morning. New files waited on my desk. Priority review. Marked in bold lettering. I opened the first document slowly. Corporate ownership records filled the screen. Each page connected to another entity. Another transfer. Another transaction. My eyes moved carefully from line to line. Then something stopped me. A cluster of shell companies appeared beneath one central holding entity. The department overseeing those records matched Lawrence's division, the same accountant who had supposedly retired overnight. My pulse quickened. I stepped into the restroom a few minutes later, needing a moment to breathe. Cold water splashed against my face as I stared at my reflection in the mirror. How much had I missed all these years? How many decisions had been made behind closed doors while I sat quietly at the edge of the table? I had grown up believing I understood our family business. But now I realized something terrifying. I had only ever seen what they wanted me to see. Later that afternoon, while reviewing transaction timelines, I noticed something even more alarming. A sudden spike in financial activity. Massive amounts of money moving within a short period of time. Transfers stacked tightly together. Too fast. Too deliberate. Almost like someone was trying to move funds before something, or someone, caught up to them. Then I noticed the date attached to one of the largest transfers. My breath slowed as realization settled in. The transaction happened on the exact same day Lawrence had retired. That night, instead of going inside my parents' house, I parked across the street. The engine stayed off. Lights from the house glowed softly against the dark sky. Inside, I could see movement through the office window. 2 figures. My father and Daniel. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Daniel's hands moved sharply through the air. My father slammed his hand against the desk. Urgency, fear, anger, all visible without sound. I sat there in silence, gripping the steering wheel, watching the scene unfold behind glass. That was the night I stopped wondering if my family was hiding something, and started asking how much damage they were willing to cause to protect it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. My father slamming his hand against his desk while Daniel stood frozen across from him. Both of them arguing in silence behind that office window. By the time midnight passed, I was sitting at my kitchen table again. Laptop open. Files scattered around me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to finish. The overhead light cast long shadows across the table. Coffee sat untouched beside my elbow, growing colder by the minute. I stared at the screen, forcing myself to breathe slowly, evenly. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't a distant case involving strangers and faceless corporations. This was my family. My blood. And whether I wanted it or not, I was standing in the middle of it. I reopened the digital case files, scrolling through transaction logs that had once looked meaningless. Now they felt alive, each number carrying weight I hadn't felt before. This time, I wasn't browsing. I was hunting. I filtered records by property locations, narrowing the results to areas connected to commercial developments near my parents' holdings. Lines of data rearranged themselves across the screen. Patterns sharpened. Movements became clearer. One property in particular caught my attention. It had been transferred 3 times in less than 48 hours. Bought, sold, reacquired. Money moved quickly, too quickly. Not profit. Movement. Concealment. Then another thought surfaced, one that pushed its way forward whether I wanted it to or not. Thanksgiving. Months earlier, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the memory rise. The house had been filled with warm light that night. Decorations lined the walls, candles flickering along the center of the long dining table. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, mixing with laughter and conversation. Everyone had gathered. Business partners, relatives, old friends. My father stood at the head of the table like he always did, holding a glass of wine high. "Growth has never looked better," he announced proudly. "Next year will be bigger than anything we've seen before." Applause followed. Investors smiled. My cousins leaned forward with interest. And then someone turned toward me. "So, Rachel," one of my uncles asked casually, "still doing paperwork these days?" Before I could answer, my father laughed. Loud, sharp. "She's pushing papers while we build empires," he said, shaking his head. Laughter spread across the table. Not just polite laughter. Mocking laughter. Daniel laughed the loudest. That detail struck me now harder than it had back then. I opened my eyes and returned to the present, fingers hovering above the keyboard. That night, Thanksgiving, my father had mentioned a company name during his speech. A casual reference at the time. But now, I typed the name into the search bar. Results populated instantly. Multiple listings appeared. Corporate registrations, property transfers, financial authorizations, all tied to suspicious movement flagged inside the investigation. My pulse quickened. I clicked into one of the documents, scrolling deeper into the archive. Then I saw it. A file labeled Primary Transfer Authorization. My hand hovered over the trackpad for a moment before clicking. The scanned document opened slowly, lines of legal language filling the screen. Ownership structures, financial responsibilities, asset relocation approvals. Then I reached the bottom of the page. The signature line. I froze. There it was. Not Daniel. Not the accountant. My father. The shape of his signature burned into the screen like it had been carved there permanently. The strong downward stroke. The slight curve at the end. I stared at it for several seconds, unable to blink. No, that couldn't be right. There had to be another explanation. Forgery. Mistake. Coincidence. I zoomed in on the signature, enlarging it until the strokes filled half the screen. Every line matched. Every curve identical. I had seen that handwriting my entire life, on birthday cards, holiday checks, official letters he left on the kitchen counter. There was no mistaking it. I pushed back from the table, standing abruptly and pacing across the living room. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from disbelief. How long had this been happening? How many transactions had passed through his hands without me ever noticing? How many people had been affected? The questions piled on top of each other, heavier with every passing second. And then another thought slipped into my mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. For 14 years, my father had laughed at my career, mocked it, dismissed it, all while unknowingly training the one person who would eventually uncover his secrets. The realization settled deep in my chest. The next morning, my supervisor called me into his office. His expression was serious, more controlled than usual. "This case has escalated," he said, folding his hands together on the desk. "Federal prosecution level." The words landed with quiet force. More agents involved. More surveillance authorized. More attention from outside departments. Everything moving faster now. "We believe large-scale financial movement is about to happen," he continued. "Possibly an attempt to relocate assets before seizure." I nodded once, forcing my voice to remain steady. Inside, everything felt unstable. After leaving his office, I walked down the hallway slowly, barely noticing the movement around me. If this became public, if arrests followed, my family name would be tied to criminal investigation reports, headlines, court records. Every memory I had built growing up inside that house suddenly felt uncertain. That evening, I returned home again, closing the door behind me with quiet finality. The apartment felt too silent, too still. I walked to the kitchen table and reopened the same file. Scrolled down to the signature. Read it again. There was no doubt left now. No denial. No alternate explanation waiting to save us. Only truth. Heavy. Unavoidable. Permanent. That was the night I stopped hoping my family was innocent, and started preparing myself for what would happen if they weren't. My phone rang before the sun had fully risen. I was halfway down a quiet suburban road, driving toward the office, when the sound cut sharply through the silence inside my car. The caller ID lit up on the dashboard screen. "Supervisor." Too early. Too sudden. I pressed the answer button, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. "Rachel." His voice came through steady but urgent. "Report to the office immediately." No greeting. No explanation. Just instruction. "Is something wrong?" I asked carefully. A brief pause followed. "Everything is moving faster than expected," he replied. "We'll brief you when you arrive." The line disconnected. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my thoughts racing faster than the car itself. Something had shifted overnight. I could feel it the same way you feel pressure building before a storm breaks. When I stepped onto the restricted floor, the atmosphere confirmed it. More personnel crowded the hallways than I had ever seen before. Phones rang constantly. Conversations were whispered behind half-closed doors. Computer screens glowed with red status indicators flashing across dashboards. Controlled chaos. Focused urgency. No one wasted time. I reached the operations room just as my supervisor entered. "All units briefing," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. We gathered quickly around the central table. A massive digital board lit the wall, displaying multiple marked locations across the city. Red dots. More than usual. "Today is operational day," he said firmly. The words landed like a hammer strike. Operational day. The day everything moved from planning to action. Multiple warrants approved. He continued. Several locations will be searched simultaneously. Documentation seizure authorized. I watched the screen closely as he highlighted specific addresses. Then one location caught my eye. A property linked to the accounting division connected to Lawrence, the accountant who had retired overnight. My pulse slowed in a strange, unnatural way. Not panic. Anticipation. Moments later, we moved into the monitoring room. Rows of screens filled the wall, each displaying live surveillance footage from different locations. Agents moved with sharp precision, entering offices, securing documents, escorting employees outside. Doors opened. Boxes filled. Evidence collected. Everything orderly. Professional. Disciplined. I forced myself to remain still as I watched. Then one camera feed shifted to a new angle. A figure emerged from a building, flanked by 2 agents. Tall, broad shoulders, dark suit. My breath stopped. Daniel. My brother walked slowly between the officers, hands visible at his sides. His face looked pale under the morning light, eyes fixed straight ahead. Not resisting, not speaking, just walking. Something inside my chest tightened painfully. I kept my face still, refusing to let emotion surface where others could see it. Professional discipline held me upright. But inside, something cracked. Hours passed in a blur. Reports flowed in. Updates stacked on screens. More locations searched. More files collected. Then my personal phone began vibrating inside my pocket. Once. Twice. Again. I ignored it at first. Work demanded attention. Focus. Distance. But the vibration didn't stop. Finally, during a brief lull, I stepped into the hallway and pulled the phone from my pocket. Missed calls. Mother? Mother again. Father? Daniel. More calls than I could count. My stomach dropped. I pressed the voicemail icon slowly. Raising the phone to my ear, my mother's voice filled the silence. Panicked. Shaking. They took Daniel. They took him from the office. Rachel. What is happening? Her voice cracked at the end, breaking into quiet sobs. I closed my eyes briefly, pressing my back against the wall. The investigation had crossed a line now. It wasn't just data. It was family. Another voicemail notification appeared immediately after. From my father. I hesitated before pressing play. His voice sounded unfamiliar. Lower. Unsteady. Rachel, I need you to come home, he said. We don't understand what's happening. For 14 years, he had dismissed my career, laughed at it, belittled it. And now, he was calling me for help. The balance of power had shifted so suddenly it felt unreal. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the blank hallway in front of me. Later, I stepped into the restroom and locked the door behind me. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I leaned against the sink, gripping the edges tightly as I stared into the mirror. My reflection looked tired, worn, but stronger than I remembered. What do you do now? I whispered softly to myself. Protect family. Protect the law. There was no version of this story where everyone walked away untouched. Not anymore. A knock sounded on the restroom door. Rachel, my supervisor's voice called. I need you in my office. When I entered, he closed the door behind me and gestured toward a chair. This operation will move into public phase soon, he said. More arrests likely. Media involvement expected. Public phase. Exposure. Consequences. Everything accelerating. There will also be a formal recognition ceremony once operations conclude, he added. Your contributions will not go unnoticed. Recognition. The word felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to what was happening around me. That evening, I drove home slowly as the sun dipped low across the horizon. Streetlights flickered on one by one as shadows stretched across the road. I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't open the windows. Silence followed me all the way back to my apartment. When I parked, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a message. Unknown number. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening it. You need to come to your father's birthday next week. No signature. No explanation. Just a command. I stared at the message. My pulse steady but heavy. That was the moment I realized the collapse wasn't over. It was only beginning, and the next time we met as a family, nothing would ever be the same. The envelope arrived 3 days later, thick and heavy enough to feel like a warning. I held it in my hands for a long moment before opening it. The paper was expensive, heavy cream cardstock with gold lettering pressed into the surface. My father loved symbols of power, especially when other people could see them. Inside, the invitation rested perfectly centered. 70th birthday celebration. Formal attire required. Scottsdale Grand Resort Ballroom. The words felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. I ran my fingers along the raised letters, feeling the weight of expectation pressed into every detail. My father didn't do anything quietly. If he hosted an event, it had to be grand, public, memorable. But this time, something felt different. This wasn't celebration. It was preparation. The next morning at work, my supervisor called me into his office before I had even set my bag down. "You received the invitation?" he asked without looking up from his desk. I nodded. Yes. He leaned back slightly, studying me with careful attention. "You will attend," he said. Not suggested. Not requested. Required. As part of the investigation's public phase, he continued. There will be official presence at that event. Official presence. The words echoed quietly in my mind. What kind of presence? I asked. He didn't answer directly. You'll understand when the time comes, he said calmly. That evening, my mother called. Her voice sounded tired, thin, stretched tight like something about to snap. You're coming to your father's birthday. Aren't you? She asked softly. I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. This night matters to him, she added. There was something underneath her words. Not pride, not excitement. Fear. Everyone will be there, she continued. Your father plans to make announcements. What kind of announcements? I asked. Another pause. Then she spoke carefully. He's reviewing inheritance arrangements. Inheritance. The word landed hard. A public declaration of who mattered, who belonged, and who didn't. The night before the party, I stood alone in my bedroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My dress hung neatly against the closet door, simple and dark, professional without being dramatic. I chose it deliberately, not to impress, not to compete, to remain controlled, calm, unmovable. I brushed my hair slowly, watching my reflection shift under the light. For years, I had entered family gatherings hoping to be accepted, hoping to be included. But this time, I felt something entirely different. Confidence. Not loud. Not arrogant. Quiet. Steady. For the first time, I walked into that room without needing approval from anyone inside it. The resort ballroom glowed with polished elegance when I arrived. Valet attendants moved quickly outside, guiding luxury cars into neat rows. Guests stepped through the entrance laughing, dressed in formal suits and glittering gowns. Inside, the room was already crowded. Soft music drifted through the air. Crystal glasses clinked gently against each other. Conversations layered across the room like overlapping waves. When I stepped through the entrance, several heads turned immediately. Whispers followed. Low. Curious. Suspicious. I thought she wasn't invited, someone murmured behind me. I pretended not to hear. Instead, I walked slowly across the polished floor, scanning the room. My father stood near the center, surrounded by investors and business partners. He looked confident, relaxed, exactly the way he always did when people gathered to celebrate him. When his eyes landed on me, his expression shifted slightly. Not welcoming, not angry, measured, calculated. He walked toward me with slow confidence, a practiced smile forming across his face. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Look who decided to show up." Soft laughter rippled through the group surrounding him. "Still working behind a desk somewhere," he added casually. More laughter followed. The sound echoed in the room like it had so many times before. But this time, it didn't hurt. Not the way it used to. I felt nothing. Not embarrassment. Not shame. Just distance. That realization surprised me more than anything else. Later, he pulled me aside near the edge of the ballroom. Away from the crowd. Away from the noise. His voice dropped lower. More controlled. "I'm reviewing inheritance distribution soon," he said calmly. I said nothing. He continued. "You made your choices. Others made theirs. The company requires commitment." There it was. The quiet threat. "You'll receive something," he added. "But not equal shares. Not after the path you chose." I studied his face carefully. He still believed I had no power. Still believed my career was insignificant. Still believed laughter defined my worth. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated softly in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. One short message. "Convoy arriving in 5 minutes." My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Calm settled over me like a shield. 5 minutes. Around me, the party continued without interruption. Music played. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. No one noticed anything yet. I slowly lifted my gaze toward the large glass entrance doors across the ballroom. Outside, faint movement caught my eye. Lights. Distant at first, then growing closer. Red. Blue. Silent. Guests began turning their heads. Confusion spread across faces. My father followed their gaze, his expression tightening slightly. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered across his features. The music continued for a few seconds longer before fading into silence. Then the ballroom doors began to open. Slowly. Deliberately. Through the widening gap, rows of uniformed officers became visible, standing in perfect formation. Still. Silent. Waiting. The laughter stopped. Every voice in the room disappeared at once. And as the silence spread across the ballroom like a shadow, I realized something I had waited 14 years to witness. That was the moment the laughter ended, and the silence that followed would change my family forever. The doors opened wide enough for the entire room to see what was waiting outside. For a moment, no one moved. No music. No laughter. No sound except the faint echo of the ballroom doors settling into place. Rows of uniformed officers stood in perfect formation just beyond the entrance. Their posture was straight, shoulders squared, faces calm and unreadable. The red and blue lights from the vehicles outside reflected faintly across polished marble floors, sliding across expensive shoes and silk gowns. I felt every eye in the room shift toward them. Then toward me, the first officer stepped forward. His shoes struck the floor with sharp precision. One step, then another. Behind him, the rest followed. Their movements were synchronized, disciplined, deliberate. Each step echoed through the silent ballroom, filling the air with a rhythm that made my chest tighten. Guests instinctively moved aside. A path formed down the center of the room without anyone speaking. I watched my father carefully. For years, I had seen confidence etched into every movement he made. Control, authority, absolute certainty. But now, something had cracked. His smile had vanished completely. His posture stiffened, shoulders drawn tight as confusion settled across his face. The officers walked straight past him, didn't acknowledge him, didn't look at him. They walked as if he didn't exist, and that alone said more than words ever could. They continued forward until they reached the center of the ballroom, until they reached me. The lead officer stopped just a few feet away. His face remained calm, professional, completely steady. Then, in one sharp motion, he turned toward me, raised his hand, and saluted. The movement was so precise it cut through the air like a blade. Behind him, 250 officers saluted at the exact same moment. Perfect synchronization. Absolute silence. The soundless weight of that moment pressed against my chest harder than anything I had ever experienced. 14 years of laughter. 14 years of dismissal. 14 years of hearing my father call my career ordinary. All collapsing into one single moment of recognition. My throat tightened as I returned the salute. My hand rising slowly but steadily. Not shaking. Not uncertain. Steady. Earned. The lead officer lowered his hand and stepped forward slightly. "Rachel Monroe," he announced clearly, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "In recognition of your leadership and analytical expertise in dismantling one of the largest financial fraud networks in this region, we acknowledge your service." Whispers erupted instantly, soft at first, then louder. Shock spread across faces like wildfire. I heard fragments of disbelief behind me. "She led the investigation. That's impossible." "Wait, they're companies." Guests turned toward my father, toward my brother, toward every member of my family. The room shifted in ways I could almost feel physically. The lead officer continued speaking. Through her dedication, persistence, and commitment to justice, multiple fraudulent entities have been identified and dismantled. Assets have been recovered. Investigations remain ongoing. Ongoing. The word echoed in the air like thunder. I didn't need to look at my father to know what was happening inside him. But I did anyway. His face had gone pale. The confidence that once filled every room he entered had drained completely. His eyes met mine across the space between us. And for the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Not powerful. Not commanding. Just human. Just afraid. The silence around him grew heavier by the second. Guests who once surrounded him now stepped subtly away. Distance formed where admiration once stood. Reputation doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses quietly, piece by piece. Eventually, he moved toward me. Slowly. Carefully. Not like the man I had known growing up. This version of him looked older somehow. Smaller. His voice, when he finally spoke, barely carried beyond the space between us. "I didn't know," he said. 3 words. Simple. Empty. I studied his face carefully. For years, I had waited to hear acknowledgement from him. To hear recognition. To hear pride. But standing there in that ballroom, I realized something surprising. I didn't need pride anymore. I needed respect. "I never asked you to understand," I said quietly. My voice stayed calm. Steady. Controlled. "I never asked you to approve." He swallowed hard. Eyes flickering downward before lifting again. "What did you want?" he asked. I held his gaze without hesitation. "I needed your respect," I answered. The words landed between us like truth carved into stone. Not shouted. Not forced. Simply stated. For the first time in 14 years. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss. He simply stood there. Silent. Behind us, the ballroom remained frozen in stunned quiet. Conversations hadn't resumed. Music hadn't returned. People watched. Observed. Recalculated. I could feel it happening in real time. The shift. Respect replacing laughter. Recognition replacing dismissal. Later that night, after the officers had left and the crowd began dissolving into smaller groups, I stepped outside alone. Cool night air wrapped around me as I walked across the parking lot. The noise from inside the ballroom faded behind me, replaced by the soft hum of distant traffic. I paused beside my car and looked back at the building. 14 years. 14 years of proving myself without applause. Without acknowledgement. Without support. And yet, standing there beneath the quiet night sky, I realized something deeper than victory. This had never been about revenge. Not truly. It had been about endurance. Persistence. Refusing to let someone else define the size of my future. I opened the car door slowly but didn't step inside right away. Instead, I stood there for one final moment, letting the silence settle into something peaceful. Because sometimes, The loudest victories aren't spoken at all. They're witnessed. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever had someone laugh at your dreams, if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, then you already understand what it means to keep going when no one believes in you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone close to you? Did you stay silent? Or did you prove them wrong in your own way? And if this story reminded you of your own strength, stay with us here. There are more stories like this, stories about dignity, resilience, and the quiet kind of power that changes everything when the moment finally comes. Because sometimes, the greatest respect you'll ever earn is the one you build in silence.